You were just listening to the sounds of the Anthem of Chad. I sound like a jazz radio.
Yeah. And this has been the Anthem of Chad. I believe it's called something like My Sweet Chad or something.
No way. You're making that up.
I'm definitely making that up.
It's Sweet Chad. Fuck out of here.
It's got a weird name.
So we're going to be talking this week about a very complex region that has been in the news recently because American and French forces have basically been forced to withdraw.
As Ben said, they recently threw out the last American forces that had been residing there since, I believe, 2003. And France had been sort of there on and off since 1960. And it's a very interesting region, right? That it's always been sort of in flux since like the 12th century.
Yeah.
And
it's just another one of those parts of the globe where it just feels like peace and, stability is not really meant to exist. It's partly because of the environment, right?
Yeah. It's a very unique environment to be in.
We should probably clarify for the listeners that it's kind of confusing, right? Because we're sort of referring to the geographic region rather than the countries a lot of the time. Because when you talk about the Sahel, it's sort of, rather than being like a state, it's more of just like this one continuous environmental belt that stretches, from Western Africa into Central Africa.
And additionally, a lot of these countries were sort of carved up by European powers, but don't really represent the actual ethnic groups or sort of self-identified nations, and we can get into that a little bit later.
Definitely a lot of ethnic groups to
touch on.
And also just groups in general, the rabbit hole that this is when you go down to the amount of ethnic groups and terrorist groups and government, militias.
Yeah. And unrecognized governments. Yeah. It could really be its own episode.
But what is it what's the difference between the Sahel and say the Sahara Desert just north of it, or the actual sub-Saharan Africa,
Well, it's sort of an interesting climatological region. It's that transition zone. We don't have anything like it in the US because south of it, you're essentially running into more tropical regions and more equatorial regions. And north of it is just blasted desert and sand dunes. So it is really this sort of dry area, but it does encounter these very serious floods in 2010 and even this year, a few months ago. There was massive flooding throughout the region. There's a series of rivers, including the Niger River and the Ghana River. Might need to edit that. Where a lot of people live around them. But again, that makes them very, very vulnerable to a lot of these climatological issues.
And are people trying to farm, or are they I think from what I know, there's a lot of herding.
Yeah.
And, herding requires grass, so...
Grass grows, but there's not a lot of tree cover, and so they're not really able to grow... they don't really have organized agriculture in the way that we would consider it in the West. Most of the industry there is mining based. The neighboring country of Mali is very, very famous for its gold extraction. And one of the nations to the direct west is Mauritania. It produces most of the world's iron. It's famous for its, giant train that just runs from the center of the Sahara Desert out to the coast, bringing iron to the shipping lanes. But, as with a lot of other countries, places that have scarce resources really struggle with a lot of conflict because there's so much competition for for that scarcity.
And also, just looking at a map of the Sahel, it sort of stretches across a large swath of Africa that hasn't been stable, for the last 50 some odd years. Mali, Niger, and Chad. And also Sudan.
Sudan seems to be constantly in crisis. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, South Sudan and Sudan.
It is very interesting that if you look to the direct south, some of those neighboring countries do seem to be more stable simply by merit of climate. Like Nigeria is one of the largest economies in the world now. And
they've even threatened to intervene, right, in some of these crises.
Last year during the ECOWAS crisis, and we can get into that a little bit if we want. Nigeria was the first ones to sort of stand up in the international community and say, we want to intervene.
It would be interesting to see like African alliance of sorts actually take those types of measures, because I think everyone's pretty much given up on the UN at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of gets into a weird situation, right? Like African colonialism on other African nations could be sort of a problem.
Well, before colonialization, it was just called conquering your enemy, which
fair point.
Which happened a lot in Africa.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, again, this is another instance where some guy in this case, most likely Paris, drew up the sort of map of this region.
Berlin, but yeah.
Well, I'm like maybe in the conference itself, but I'm saying the actual map maker.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Because most of these countries were under French rule, so it's like most of Africa, the actual boundaries of the country mean almost nothing. It's all about the ethnic groups within the country and what they represent, and all. It's basically like nobody's happy.
And no one will ever be happy because these borders have become so codified. I mean, one of the biggest ones, and one that often makes the news, is in Mali. You have the Tuaregs, who are they seem to be in rebellion every 2 years.
Yeah. And they also make killer music.
Oh yeah. We'll post some links in the show notes.
Yeah. If it wasn't like such a dangerous region, I would love to go. I mean, a lot of the guys from Tuareg bands now live abroad.
Yeah, a lot of them in France, because Mali speaks French, so it's an easier transition.
But I think they spread. They are quite dominant in Mali, but I believe the Tuareg ethnic group spreads basically from Mali to Algeria to Niger, because I know a lot of Tuaregs fought in Gaddafi's army.
Well, I believe they're traditionally a nomadic group.
Yeah,
they're one of the ethnic groups that had trade routes that crossed the Sahara for hundreds of years. Fascinating
group of people. We don't have time to go into an ethnography of them, but I would encourage anyone listening to just go and look them up, because they have a really unique culture and style of dress, and they're not as you'll find out later in the episode, they don't really mess with anybody but themselves.
Yeah. And really, because Mali is a Muslim country, and it's that very specific brand of radical Islam that seems to crop up in Northern Africa a lot. They tend to sort of find themselves allied with other Muslim radical terrorist groups such as Boko Haram and what was the one you were talking about before?
These guys are great. No, I mean they're not.
Edit.
Wait, where is? I mean, this sounds like a combination between radical leftist movement from San Francisco and ISIS. It's the movement for oneness and jihad in West Africa. It's like the first part is like, oh, cool, the movement for oneness. And
it's like, wait, hold on.
It's like, wait, pause.
Movement is a very funny thing to call it. That really adds to the hippie thing. It does seem that every time they hook up with one of these groups, and I think they were sort of connected to members of Al Qaeda who were in North Africa, it sort of lasts for a couple of months.
Yeah.
And then they're like, actually, we don't really want to deal with this. This isn't really our bag. Yeah. We just want to be Tuaregs in the desert.
I mean, I think they're like opportunists, and they basically see enemy of my enemy kind of thing.
Yeah.
They see these Islamic groups, and they're like, well, if we unite with them, they're powerful. They're sort of a powerful force, and they can easily overpower the government, whatever the might consist of.
Unfortunately for them, and unfortunately for, being because they're such opportunists, and that's who they're linking up with, they did sort of get caught up in the global war on terror in 2003, when America sort of deployed fangs across the world. I think a lot of people sort of picture the global, the war on terror, and they think of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. But really, we deployed forces to Northern Africa, Southeast Asia, and a lot of other countries in the Middle East as well. And one of those, part of that operation, known as Operation Enduring Freedom, you've probably seen patches that say OEF in pictures of soldiers, was Operation Juniper Shield, which was the American deployment to Niger. And so we started to strengthen the government there and run a lot of counterterrorism ops, because we saw it, America saw it as an important region to control, or to at least try and secure.
Well, I mean, Al-Qaeda was directly operating there, and it sort of had been viewed as this area that was perfect for terrorist training and recruitment, because such a vast desert in the Sahara, and then you also have the Sahel region, and it's just like very limited government control, especially in these rural areas. I mean, basically the government could care less about what's going on in the Sahara unless there's resources there.
Yeah,
because to them it's just this great waste expanse, and like, especially as Al-Qaeda was losing ground and being pushed out of other places, they sought refuge. And you have these influxes, right? Like where other conflicts around Africa led to, some of these groups coming into that region. Like, for example, the civil war in Libya. After that, there was a massive influx of weapons and fighters into this region, into Mali and other places like that.
I mean, Mali is pretty much a terrorist nation. They've locked their borders down. I don't think they're recognized by the UN. Maybe fact check me on that. But generally speaking,
not putting much into what the UN says.
Yeah. But yeah, as you said, they're sort of perfect training grounds and recruiting grounds. And so America did deploy, and especially set up an important air base in the northern city of Agadez in Niger. They invested about $11 million and built a massive runway to support surveillance flights and drone operations throughout the region. It's actually turned out to be an incredibly important base for us.
Does that mean we were carrying out drone strikes and stuff like that I
believe that's where we launched the drone strikes on Gaddafi from, or the missiles on Gaddafi from.
A lot of that was from sea-based stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, we've provided a lot of support and surveillance flights. Like,
yeah, that makes sense.
Surveillance is actually one of America's greatest assets to the rest of the world.
I'm sure we were doing a lot of intel, and I know that. I mean, we'll get into this later, but the French kind of took over for us a little bit farther down the line. I mean, and their involvement was much more boots on the ground. There was thousands of French troops in Mali at a certain point.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sure one of the roles of that base was like supporting the French.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not only did they deploy like actual troops, but they sort of installed their own government. In 2014, they started Operation Barkhane and installed their sort of, I wouldn't call him necessarily a puppet leader, but sort of a leader who was favorable to them. He was in Chad specifically. His name was Mahamat Idris Deby Itno, also known as Kaka. There's a lot of great names in this region as well. Nice. And this was nominally a counter-terrorist operation, but I think a lot of the world saw it as, the continuation of colonialism, right?
I mean, they also probably took a look at what we were doing, and they were like, well, we can do our own regime change. Not only the Americans can do this.
Yeah, definitely.
We will have a very, very good regime change.
I mean, people were excited when they first showed up. They sort of brought the promise of, Western, not to hail the West too much. But
also, in fairness, Islamists will make a lot of people look good.
Yeah, exactly.
Alternative. Like, they're not cutting off our hands. And
and they're actually like bringing humanitarian aid. But I think people started to slow on that when they realized, like, actually, this is colonialism, part 2 Electric Boogaloo.
I mean, but their operations lasted for about a decade. I mean, from like 2012 or so up until recently.
Yeah, seriously.
And I'm sure there was a lot of French Foreign Legion involvement there, which is always a fascinating sort of can of worms.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, they're half criminal.
That was kind of the point.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the Operation Juniper Shield and Operation Enduring Freedom did bring stability to the region, but it did sort of come at a cost of these nations like Mali and Chad's independence from the West. Right. They'd been sort of trying to set up their own economic zone. As we mentioned earlier, there was ECOWAS, and they were trying to sort of legitimize themselves, right? And to have two major Western nations show up and be like, actually, we're the ones who are going to build your country and secure your country, probably left a bad taste in their mouth.
Yeah, well, I think, some people have pointed out that the reason why the French involvement, at least, was a failure was their initial operation to just beat the terrorists and drive them out was successful and popular, but then they stayed for another 9 years.
Yeah.
And everyone was like, okay, thanks for that. But, it's again, parallels to what we tried to do in the Middle East. Like, when, everything was successful, we toppled the government, but then it was what came after.
Yeah, that nation building.
Issue, and just sort of having to have these people stay in, again, like a pretty inhospitable region where sending people to, northern Mali is kind of like, it's just a no-go zone. Even French troops were probably just going in helicopters, dropping down, doing something, and getting out.
Yeah. It's just hard it's a really hard region to operate in.
And expansive. I think people don't really quite grasp that. Africa is huge, and this region of northern Mali, is probably, as big as, West Texas.
Yeah.
So,
hard to control, hard to provide security to. And in addition, you can sort of understand why people had so much resentment. Like, their economy was still tied to Europe's. Like, Niger, roughly 50% of their economy was foreign aid. And when they were sanctioned after the 2023 ECOWAS crisis, their economy fell apart. Yeah. They didn't have power. 70% of the country's power was coming from Nigeria, and they didn't have kids were going to school in the dark. Yeah. People weren't able to buy bread and basic supplies. And so you can see why there's a lot of resentment towards the West.
Yeah. And also, whenever you do regime change, you sort of the puppet rulers you install become you're sort of representative.
Oh yeah.
And then it always happens that they end up, because they feel like they have this protection, right, from France or the US or whatever, that they just I'm protected, so I can do whatever I want. And then they usually end up, inevitably becoming corrupt and unpopular in their own right, and then that's you sort of, that gets associated with you. So especially
Matmat Idris Deby, he'd been trained in France.
Yeah.
He'd gone to military school in Aix-en-Provence, and I think to the military, one of the military institutes in Pennsylvania.
Might as well have been a French officer.
Yeah, I think he might have been a French officer for a while. In fact, it's you gotta call a zebra by its stripes, right? He doesn't exactly represent these people, and to my knowledge, I believe he sort of he's won a series of elections, but they've been sort of weird wins. His competitors have pulled out, they've been killed, they've been kidnapped, and so it's a little bit of a weird situation for the people to then be like, oh yeah, he's our elected leader.
Yeah. Maybe we should just go back for a second and just make a distinction between also maybe just because I think we've gotten there chronologically, what led up to the 2012 Tuareg rebellion, and like, I just feel like we should distinguish that from the Islamic.
Sure, yeah,
movements
definitely.
that were going on, because I feel like they had separate goals. Like the Tuareg goal was to establish a ethnic Tuareg state, in northern Mali. And, they just found themselves allied with these Islamic groups, basically against the government.
Yeah.
But there's sort of this legendary concert that would take place every summer out in the middle of the desert. And there was a lot of Tuareg music with, and they play like rock and roll, so like guitars. And, if this didn't turn into an armed rebellion at the end, it sounded like a hell of a show.
Yeah.
Because, it's just like,
talk about blowing the doors off.
Gathering in the middle of the Sahara with thousands and thousands of Tuaregs and just like other desert people, and they listen to great music. There's also this psychedelic that I don't really remember the name of, but is quite popular out there. That's
there's like Beetle and Kai.
They all take at these shows, and then this show, they had one of these in 2012. I think it's like a desert. They call it like Desert Fest or something similar to that. And after the show, everybody was so amped up that they hopped in their truck and started a rebellion.
I mean, what's the government's resistance to them forming their own state?
Well, I don't know. I think they just have to, because they're the government, and anytime someone tries to secede, you have to just
doing it because it's cool.
I mean, like, again, I feel like if it was really up to them, they'd be like, oh, you want the Saharan, like northern Saharan desert part of Mali, like, go for it. But there has to be something there worth holding on to.
I think northern Mali is sort of, it's the start of both branches of the Niger River. The one branch goes down through Nigeria, the other one goes out through Guinea and Sierra Leone.
Yeah.
And Mali has famously been a region that, as I think we mentioned before, famous for its gold production, gold mining.
Yeah.
And so it would be, I sort of wonder if the government was like, well, wait a second, you can't just like claim the gold reserves.
Oh, you know what? That actually reminds me of something that I read about. Actually, one of the things that has made the Tuaregs so like, easily, upset and rebellious is that a lot of the mining has poisoned the ground.
That would do it.
In that region, and they can no longer, sustain their herds, grow anything. I think that it's mostly hurting because they're nomadic. I don't know how much agriculture is going on, but no, I mean the mining has poisoned the ground and has just sort of made their traditional lifestyle not doable. So what else are they going to do?
That they've had for thousands of years, right?
Yeah. So they fight. Whether it's in Gaddafi's army or in their own rebellions, they're just like, well, what's there to lose?
Yeah,
basically.
yeah. And that's the thing, is there's everything to gain, right?
Mm. But like I think we mentioned earlier, when they did start this rebellion in 2012, it just sort of set off like a decade of unrest that's just sort of overall known as the Mali War. That's basically continuing to this day.
Yeah.
But eventually for whatever reason, they came to a disagreement with the various Islamic groups that they were working with. I mean, there were some Al-Qaeda, some ISIS, the people we mentioned before, the Oneness.
The movement for oneness and Islamic Jihad, and Boko Haram as well, who play a big part in that region, especially in Cote d'Ivoire and Sierra Leone as well.
And there was also this one very sort of charismatic Islamist ethnic Tuareg Islamist guy. Forgive me if I butcher his name. His first name is Iyad Ag Ghali.
It's a great name.
Yeah, he's his nickname is the Strategist. So pretty cool. Something out of a movie.
Yeah. Probably sounds better in French.
He founded one of these sort of multitudes of Islamic groups, Ansar Dine, and he was just sort of through his gravitas and charisma, he managed to convince a lot of ethnic Tuaregs to sort of come over to his side. And I think at a certain point, these guys started realizing that being a part of one of these jihadi movements was actually more profitable
Yeah.
than their own interpret, like sort of.
Well, just more organization and more funding, right?
Yeah.
Two pretty important legs of the of a like organization. But just to jump forward a little bit in time, now that America's been expelled from this region, I mean, it seems like Russia is starting to step in, right? And recently a video was aired on, I believe it was Nigerian, not Nigerian, confusingly.
Yeah.
The people of Niger are Nigerian.
It's spelled the same though.
Yeah, it's quite confusing. Or it might be with an E, but that's besides the point. But it was aired on the national television channel in Niger of Russian soldiers coming off of a plane and like giving an interview about the security operations that they were going to commence in the region. And it's like, wait a second, you just like change, you just switched out one boogeyman for another, right?
Yeah. Well, that's been an ongoing thing in Central Africa, and we touched on it a bit on our episode about the Wagner Group. But sort of like, as Western countries like France and US have withdrawn from these regions, Russia's kind of come in and replaced them. And, I guess it's like the enemy you know versus the enemy you don't know. I mean, I already used the cliche phrase earlier.
Yeah.
But, just like they have yet to live under Russian. They're like, oh, let's try the Russians.
It can't be worse.
Yeah, well,
I think when we were researching this show, one of the things that came up, we found a picture of Putin shaking hands with the president of Chad or maybe Niger. Worth a Google. But like in the background of the picture, it's on a billboard, and the background of the picture is just like a very desolate, bombed out looking town. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. And it's sort of striking, that
it's essentially a dirt road with a bunch of trash and like some huts basically that have like, shingle roofs and bricks.
Yeah. And it's sort of a perfect metaphor, right? That despite all this political posturing, the reality of these people's lives are not really going to change, just depending on who the Western or, whoever the more developed ally might be.
Yeah. But, Russia is not going to come into your country and fight Islamists for free. Nothing's a charity.
Yeah.
Certainly not though in the Russian world, I think my theory is, and I don't know if this is correct, but basically they're pissed at the West, understandably so. I mean, we've been backing Ukraine. Up until recently we basically weren't, but
yeah,
we did just pass that aid bill. But we've essentially been backing Ukraine really hard, and it's pissing them off. So Putin, I think, sort of gave the order to sort of put the pedal to the metal in terms of their Africa operations. And, however that's working, whether it's FSB behind the scenes or, Wagner Group, a.k.a. Africa Corps.
Yeah.
Which just, okay. So
pitch perfect, on every turn they seem to just want to be like the movie villain, the movie villains.
More Nazi-like.
Yeah.
But, I think Putin basically gave the order to say, hey, we need to start meddling more in the places where we can where Western influence can be sort of cracked.
Well, I think there's also a lot of value in the resource colonialism that we're seeing, sort of that economic colonialism that we're seeing. Like the Wagner Group has sort of has in the past acted in that capacity in Syria. I think we talked about that a little bit on our Prigozhin episode.
Yeah.
And to be able to like, gain control of the iron reserves in Mauritania, the gold reserves in Mali and Niger. These are important resources if you want to like maintain and grow your influence in the world.
Yeah.
So, why not get it at the source as opposed to having to buy it on the market with your terrible currency, the ruble, that couldn't buy a bushel of grain, let alone.
Apparently, the Russians have been using gold as a way to sort of get around sanctions. Sort of like the world's original cryptocurrency.
That's good.
Just like, how about a couple bars of gold?
Yeah, it's untraceable.
Buy gold now.
Yeah. But the irony sort of abounds, right? Because at the end of the day, these Central African, Western Saharan nations that have been trying to develop their own economy, they developed their own form of the franc. It's called the CFA franc, and it's backed by the euro. But in order to float this currency, half of their foreign exchange currency is held by the Bank of France.
Yeah.
So
ironies abound.
Yeah, even though like they can hand over security control to Russia, their economy is still is tied to Europe and tied to the Eurozone. It's as you said, it's incredibly ironic.
Yeah.
And I think it still breeds a lot of frustration there.
It just seems like in the last 5 years or so, there's been coups in 4 countries in that same region. That to me just reads as too much of a coinky-dink, you know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%.
Chad, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso all had governments that were most of them democratically elected, overthrown by military forces, basically military juntas, and they all at the same time decided that they wanted France and the US to leave, and then they all decided that they wanted Russian advisors to come in.
Well, it sort of does circle back to our topic of conversation at the beginning of the podcast, which was like, the names of these borders and the names of these countries don't really matter. It's not really about the country that was, the lines that were drawn on a map 200, 300 years ago. Yeah. It's more about the people who live there and the sentiments that they have.
Yeah. No, it's very much on a local level, like city by city, town by town.
Yeah. It does bring up these questions of what does stability look like there in the next 50 years. Nigeria is on track to be one of the biggest economies in the world. One of the leading voices in geopolitics, Peter Zeihan, says they're on track to have 1 billion people.
Yeah.
Don't know about that one, but
maybe eventually.
Yeah, on a long enough timeline.
They definitely have a higher birth rate than some of the countries in the developed world.
But like what does stability look like for this region, and what does who's going to be the people to provide it? Because they clearly don't want the West to do it anymore.
I think basically we got the message, and the France and the US are like, okay.
Well, you know how France is with their advances towards women. I think they're a little bit like that with their advances towards Africa as well. Like,
are you back?
Are you sure?
But I am
insert Pepe Le Pew.
But I am wearing such a wonderful fragrance.
Madame, I promise, not this time.
Where is my hugger?
You are taking a shower without me?
Oh, God. But yeah, I think the overall point is the French are petty. And
and
basically, like, you don't want us? Okay, we leave. And, I think like a lot of regions, like in the Middle East, I feel like in the next 100 years that security is going to be turned over to regional powers and just like,
Definitely. One last thing I just want to touch on, sorry for interrupting you, is that in this region that we've sort of brought up a couple times, ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of Western African States, they are trying to create their own currency now. It's called the ECO. sort of uninventively, but and it represents sort of a desire to move away from those Western powers and move away from using the franc. And is that sort of that first move towards independence? And like, does that mean that, on a long enough timeline, we will see them become a major player?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of factors here in this region that are sort of immovable. It seems to me like environmental factors that don't really seem to me like they're going to be getting better.
Yeah, with the
drier, hotter, more air, just like.
Yeah, with climate change and larger floods as well. Like you look at the floods in Western Europe, out of like Belgium, where like it's ravaging the countryside. Like think about how bad it is for, in England and Germany and Belgium when these happen. And those are countries with like fairly stable economies in the Eurozone. Think about a place that doesn't have that much economic stability. Like,
yeah, I mean, there's also just a ton of history in these countries. And like, Mali, there's Timbuktu, which is like, has a bunch of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Some of which were destroyed when it was occupied by, Islamists. But, this was like once a great, region, and there was the Ghanaian Empire, which Timbuktu I think was the capital.
Yeah, and the Malian Empire as well. And as you said, these are incredibly historic places. Like, the Sahel is like widely considered to be where humanity like went from being apes to being like what we would call modern humans. Yeah. I believe it's 10 million years ago. Like this is an ancient part of the world, and these feuds run deep.
Yeah.
And so it's.
But some of these ethnic groups, like the Tuaregs, I feel like they, kind of like the Kurds, like they really do probably deserve their own state.
Oh yeah.
The likelihood, because they cross so many different countries' borders. The Kurds, in their case, it's because they want to claim all the oil.
Yeah.
But,
from Western Syria to Northern Iraq, it's free Kurdistan.
It's just like, I feel like the Tuaregs, whether or not they've allied with the Islamic, groups in the past, like, I feel like they, like you're saying, they're like an ancient people. And if you study them, the more you study them, the more you're like, wow, these really are an ancient people. And if you want to talk about like people that are deserving of a state, it's like, I feel like the longer you've been around, the more claim you have to,
dude, some people have used that.
Some debates.
Yeah. A lot of people have used that for some interesting political movements. This has been an episode of the War Boys podcast.
Thanks so much for tuning in, and tune in next time for maybe China?
Finally.
Finally?
Maybe China.